Well, do you know what happened to his wife?
Yeah, I know she got killed.
What
I mean,
Well,
because I know how this stuff works, okay? Don't get me wrong, you're right, I have been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
And I wish I had been recording this because now it sounds like, there's, you're selling these people, and now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me.
No,
now
what-
I got that sense.
Well, what do
I
you
can't believe this.
So,
Los Angeles, 1986. A city of dreams, where ambition drives people to unimaginable heights. A place where fortunes are made, and secrets are buried beneath the glamour. In the heart of this sprawling metropolis, a young woman's life was stolen in an act of violence so brutal, so personal, that it sent shockwaves through her family and friends. The crime scene told a chilling story, signs of a desperate struggle, shattered glass, a trail of blood. A bite mark, embedded deep into her flesh, left behind like a signature from a ghost. The investigators pieced together a theory, one that fit neatly into the crime patterns of the time. A robbery gone wrong. A home invasion that turned deadly. The case was marked by tragedy, yet it was soon overshadowed by the rising tide of crime sweeping through the city. Time moved forward, as it always does. Files were closed, evidence was stored away, and memories of that terrible day faded into whispers. But something didn't sit right. The victim's father refused to let go, his grief transforming into a relentless pursuit of justice. He begged the authorities to look closer, to examine what had been overlooked. There was another name that should have been on their list, a name that was never spoken in those early days of the investigation. A woman with a past tied to the victim's husband. A woman trained in tactics, deception, and control. A woman who carried a badge. Stephanie Lazarus was more than just another officer in the Los Angeles Police Department. She was one of their own, a respected detective, a protector of the people, a woman who had built a career hunting criminals and solving complex cases. But in the quiet corners of the evidence room, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and time, a single piece of DNA waited to tell a different story. And when that truth finally surfaced, it did more than solve a decades-old murder. It shattered the very foundation of trust in those sworn to uphold the law. This is the case of Detective Stephanie Lazarus, the officer who was supposed to bring justice, until she became the one running from it. Los Angeles, California, the mid-1980s. A city in flux. The streets were filled with ambition, crime, and the pursuit of success. It was a time when the LAPD held an iron grip on law and order, yet beneath the surface, corruption and secrecy festered in the shadows. Amid this backdrop, 3 lives became entangled in a story of love, obsession, and betrayal, one that would take decades to unravel. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old, a woman whose intelligence and kindness were matched only by her drive to succeed. She had risen quickly in her field, becoming the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, a position she earned through sheer determination. Those who knew her spoke of her warmth, her compassion. She had dedicated her life to helping others. But in 1986, someone decided that life should end. Her husband, John Rutan, was an engineer. Tall, charming, and driven, he had met Sherri at a party, and their connection was instant. They shared dreams of building a future together, of growing old side by side. They had married just a few months before, sealing what seemed to be the perfect love story. But every love story has a past, and John's past had a name. Stephanie Lazarus, a fellow student from UCLA, an old girlfriend, and, most importantly, a police officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. John and Stephanie had met in college, and for years, their relationship had been one of casual romance, a connection that flickered on and off without ever fully igniting into something serious. To John, it had been just that, a college fling, a relationship that ran its course. To Stephanie, it had been something more. Long after John had moved on, after he had chosen Sherri as his wife, Stephanie still lingered in the background. She visited him at his office unannounced, leaving notes for him to find. She showed up at the condo he shared with Sherri, pressing for one last chance, unable, or unwilling, to accept that their time had passed. Sherri had confided in her parents about Stephanie. She had told them that she felt uneasy, that she was being watched. She had even voiced her fears directly to John, warning him that his ex-girlfriend was not letting go. And then, on the morning of February 24, 1986, Sherri Rasmussen's life came to a brutal end. Her body was found in the living room of the condo she shared with John, a crime scene so violent that investigators initially believed it had been the work of burglars. Sherri had been beaten, shot 3 times in the chest, her body left sprawled on the floor, her wedding vows barely months old. A bite mark on her arm. A bite mark that would later tell the story no one wanted to hear. The police ruled it a robbery gone wrong. The case was filed away, another tragedy in a city where crime was all too common. But something was missing. A name. A connection. A suspect hiding in plain sight. For years, no one looked in the right place. Because no one wanted to believe that a woman who had sworn to protect and serve could be capable of something so cold-blooded. And yet, the truth was there, waiting to be found. Waiting for the moment when the past would finally catch up with the killer. February 24, 1986. A call to 911. A frantic voice on the other end. A crime so brutal that even seasoned officers struggled to process what they saw. Inside the condominium at 7100 Balboa Boulevard, a nightmare had unfolded. Sherri Rasmussen lay on the living room floor, her body twisted unnaturally, signs of a violent struggle visible across the room. Her face was swollen, bruised, and bloody. The struggle had been prolonged. She had fought back with everything she had. Glass shards littered the carpet, a broken vase nearby. Furniture was overturned. A porcelain figurine had been shattered, its fragments scattered like evidence of desperation. It was a scene that told a story of resistance, fear, and unimaginable violence. The immediate assumption? A robbery gone wrong. There had been a string of burglaries in the area, and at first glance, the crime scene seemed to match the pattern. The sliding glass door was ajar, a sign of forced entry. The burglars had supposedly panicked when they found someone home. A struggle ensued, and it had ended in murder. A ransacked condo. A missing VCR. Jewelry missing from the bedroom. A young woman's life stolen in what appeared to be a senseless act of violence. But something about the crime scene didn't add up. The way Sherri's body had been positioned, the brutal beating she had endured before she was shot, it wasn't typical of a home invasion. The burglars had supposedly taken a few items, yet valuables remained untouched. The violence seemed deeply personal. And then, there was the bite mark. On Sherri's arm, deep and distinct. A wound that spoke louder than any stolen object. A wound that would later become the key to solving a case that had been buried for decades. Detectives' perspective, a flawed investigation. LAPD detectives arrived at the scene, quickly forming their initial theory. Given the recent burglaries, it was easy to conclude that Sherri had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. They collected evidence, dusted for prints, and documented the struggle, yet one crucial step was missed. The bite mark. It was swabbed, recorded, and noted in the autopsy report. But it wasn't immediately tested. DNA analysis wasn't yet a common investigative tool in 1986, and without pressure to pursue other leads, the case fell into the category of routine home invasions. One lead, however, was ignored entirely. Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, had a different theory. From the beginning, Nels Rasmussen wasn't convinced by the burglary theory. His daughter was strong, independent, and highly intelligent. She wouldn't have left the doors unlocked. She wouldn't have let someone in without a reason. And most importantly, she had told him, in the weeks leading up to her death, that she was afraid. Sherri had confided in her father about a woman from John's past. A woman who had been following her, showing up unannounced, watching her. A woman who had even entered their condo once, claiming she was just there to see John. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus. Nels repeatedly pushed detectives to investigate this woman, to look into her connection with his daughter's murder. But each time, he was met with indifference. "They told me I watched too much TV," he would later say. The police weren't interested. They had their theory, and it was far easier to blame an unknown burglar than to investigate one of their own. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just an ex-girlfriend struggling to move on. She was a woman scorned. A woman who refused to accept that John Rutan had chosen someone else. In the months leading up to Sherri's murder, Stephanie's behavior escalated. She showed up at Sherri's workplace unannounced, confronting her directly. According to Sherri's colleagues, she was visibly shaken after these encounters. Stephanie had made her presence known, reminding Sherri that she had history with John, a history that wasn't over. She even went as far as appearing at the couple's condo while John was away. Sherri had come home one evening to find Stephanie standing inside her living room. The explanation? She had just come by to see John. That was the moment Sherri knew. Stephanie wasn't just lurking in the background. She was a threat. Sherri told her father everything. She told John, too, but he dismissed it. Stephanie's just a friend, he reassured her. She means no harm. But Sherri knew better. She told her father that if anything ever happened to her, look at Stephanie Lazarus. And just weeks later, Sherri was dead. The overlooked evidence. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, investigators didn't connect the dots. The crime scene was staged to look like a burglary gone wrong. The missing items, the forced entry, it all fit a pattern. But there were inconsistencies. Sherri had been brutally beaten before being shot. That level of rage wasn't typical for a robbery. The struggle had been personal, prolonged. The killer had taken their time. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was the most telling clue, but it was ignored. No one checked for female suspects. No one thought to test the saliva. And no one questioned Stephanie Lazarus. Instead, the case went cold. For over 2 decades, Sherri Rasmussen's murder remained unsolved, classified as a random act of violence. But secrets don't stay buried forever. A cold case reopened, 60 to 120 minutes. By the mid-2000s, forensic science had advanced significantly. DNA testing had become a powerful investigative tool, capable of solving cases that had once seemed impossible. In 2009, the LAPD's cold case unit began re-examining unsolved homicides. Sherri Rasmussen's case resurfaced. A young detective, unfamiliar with the original investigation, looked at the file with fresh eyes. The bite mark evidence stood out. DNA from the saliva had been collected at the time of the murder, but never tested. Now, after 23 years, the sample was analyzed. The results were undeniable. The DNA belonged to a woman. That single revelation shattered the original burglary theory. There had been no female burglars operating in the area. And this wasn't a random crime. Someone close to Sherri had attacked her. Someone with a personal grudge. The detectives combed through old reports, looking for female suspects. That's when they found Stephanie Lazarus's name buried in the case notes. A former LAPD officer, John Rutan's ex-girlfriend. A woman Sherri Rasmussen had been afraid of before her death. And now, the DNA evidence pointed directly to her. Stephanie Lazarus had spent her career in law enforcement. By 2009, she had risen through the ranks, working in the LAPD's elite art theft detail. She was respected, trusted, and had spent decades solving crimes. And 23 years after Sherri Rasmussen's murder, justice was finally within reach. For 23 years, Stephanie Lazarus had lived her life as a respected detective, hiding in plain sight. But the weight of her past had finally caught up to her. The science that broke the case. By the mid-2000s, DNA analysis had advanced to a level where even old evidence could tell a new story. The bite mark left on Sherri Rasmussen's arm had always been a crucial piece of evidence, one that had been ignored for decades. Now, forensic specialists extracted a full DNA profile from the preserved saliva sample. It was female, and when they ran it through law enforcement databases, there was no immediate match. Stephanie Lazarus's name wasn't flagged automatically. She was in the system as a detective, not as a suspect. But the cold case detectives had already begun connecting the dots. The next step? They needed to confirm what they already suspected. They needed Stephanie Lazarus's DNA. The undercover DNA sting. Detectives couldn't just ask Stephanie for a DNA sample outright. She was too experienced. She knew police tactics, investigative procedures, and, most of all, how to cover her tracks. So, they set up an operation. Stephanie often grabbed coffee during her shifts, and detectives trailed her one afternoon. They watched as she sipped from a cup, casually chatting with colleagues before tossing it in the trash. The moment she walked away, the undercover team swooped in. They retrieved the cup and rushed it to the lab. The results came back quickly, a perfect match to the DNA from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm. There was no doubt anymore. Stephanie Lazarus wasn't just a suspect. She was the killer. On June 5, 2009, detectives walked into the LAPD's Parker Center, where Stephanie was working her shift. They asked her to come to an interrogation room under the pretense of discussing a case. She didn't suspect a thing. At first, she was relaxed, even jovial. Then the detectives steered the conversation towards Sherri Rasmussen. Her demeanor shifted instantly. Her breathing quickened. Her eyes darted. You know, I don't really remember much," she stammered. The room fell silent. For the first time in over 2 decades, Stephanie Lazarus realized she had lost control of the narrative. Minutes later, uniformed officers entered the room. Stephanie Lazarus, a 25-year veteran of the LAPD, was placed in handcuffs. As her colleagues, officers who had once respected her, watched in stunned silence, she was led away. A detective was now the accused, and the world wanted answers. It was a scandal the department couldn't contain. Headlines called it the LAPD's darkest secret and a cop killer in uniform. Interviews with Sherri Rasmussen's parents surfaced, with Nels Rasmussen tearfully telling reporters, "I told them to look at her. I told them from the start. But they didn't listen." The LAPD scrambled to control the damage. Officers who had worked with Stephanie were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. For years, they had trusted a murderer. And for 23 years, justice had been denied. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus stood trial for the first-degree murder of Sherri Rasmussen. Prosecutors laid out their case with chilling precision. The evidence that sealed her fate. 1. DNA evidence. The bite mark on Sherri's arm was an exact match to Stephanie's DNA. It was indisputable. 2. Motive. Testimony after testimony confirmed Stephanie's obsession with John Ruetten and her hatred for Sherri. 3. Staged burglary. The crime scene wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was a carefully planned murder, designed to throw off investigators. Stephanie's attorneys fought back hard, claiming the DNA evidence could have been contaminated after 2 decades. There was no eyewitness placing Stephanie at the scene. Her record as a decorated officer showed that she was incapable of such violence. But there was one problem. The evidence was overwhelming. And John Ruetten himself took the stand. His testimony wasn't dramatic, but his presence alone spoke volumes. He had moved on. Stephanie had not. And now, she was facing a lifetime in prison for a crime fueled by jealousy and obsession. For decades, Stephanie Lazarus lived a life of deception, hiding behind a badge while carrying the weight of an unsolved murder. But once the truth unraveled, the justice system delivered its verdict. Yet, the story didn't end in the courtroom. On March 8, 2012, when the guilty verdict was read, Stephanie Lazarus remained stone-faced. No tears, no remorse. Her legal team immediately announced plans for an appeal, but the judge wasted no time in delivering her sentence. 27 years to life in prison for the brutal murder of Sherri Rasmussen. As the gavel struck, there was no escaping the reality. Stephanie Lazarus, once a respected LAPD detective, was now inmate #LAP 111370 at the California Institution for Women in Corona. For Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, the moment was bittersweet. They had spent 26 years fighting for someone, anyone, to listen to them, to hear their cries for justice. And now, as Nels stood in the courtroom during the sentencing phase, his voice shook with emotion. "My daughter didn't deserve this. She was taken from us, and for years, we were ignored. If they had listened to me in 1986, we wouldn't be here today." Loretta, too devastated to speak, clung to a framed photo of Sherri, her radiant smile frozen in time. The pain of losing a daughter never fades. But at least now, they knew her killer would never hurt anyone again. Even with her life sentence, Stephanie Lazarus still had one last battle to fight, the fight for her freedom. Under California law, inmates serving life sentences with the possibility of parole are eligible for release after serving the minimum time required. For Stephanie, that meant she could start petitioning for parole by 2023. In March 2023, the unthinkable happened. Stephanie Lazarus was granted parole. The decision stunned the Rasmussen family, who had spent decades ensuring she stayed behind bars. Legal analysts pointed out that Stephanie had maintained a clean prison record, had aged out of the high-risk offender category, and had support from some former LAPD colleagues. But the public backlash was swift and severe. The Rasmussen family, backed by public outcry and a petition signed by thousands, challenged the decision. In October 2023, California Governor Gavin Newsom intervened. After reviewing the case, he rescinded the parole decision, citing the extreme brutality of the crime, Stephanie's lack of remorse, the ongoing threat to public safety. Justice, once again, had prevailed. But the battle wasn't over. By October 2024, Stephanie Lazarus appeared before the parole board again, still seeking release. This time, she presented herself as a changed woman. She claimed she had found faith and had become a mentor to younger inmates. She never directly admitted guilt, but she expressed regret for her past actions. The board wasn't convinced. They reviewed the case in full detail, recalling how Sherri Rasmussen fought for her life while Stephanie beat, shot, and bit her. Stephanie went on with her life for 23 years, never once confessing. Her lack of genuine remorse suggested she was still a danger to society. Stephanie Lazarus would remain behind bars for its policies, particularly internal investigations. Could LAPD officers effectively investigate their own? Cold case reviews. How many other cases had been mishandled, ignored, or deliberately buried? Accountability. What safeguards were in place to ensure powerful officers didn't evade justice? Policy changes and public perception. In response, the LAPD White Heavy Checkmark implemented stricter oversight on cold cases. White Heavy Checkmark increased transparency in officer-involved investigations. White Heavy Checkmark established an independent review board for potential conflicts of interest. But the damage had been done. The public lost trust in the department, and the case became a stain on the LAPD's reputation. For many, the Lazarus case was proof that power can shield even the guilty, until it doesn't. For 23 years, Sherri Rasmussen was a cold case, an open wound with no closure. For 23 years, Stephanie Lazarus wore a badge, walking freely among the very officers who should have arrested her. And for 23 years, a family was denied justice. But in the end, truth won. Stephanie Lazarus is behind bars. Sherri Rasmussen's name is no longer just a footnote in an unsolved file. And the case serves as a reminder. Warning: no one is above the law. Warning: justice delayed is not justice denied. Warning: some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. What do you think about the LAPD's handling of this case? Should Stephanie Lazarus have been granted parole? How many other cold cases might have been buried because of investigative failures? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real-life crime stories, subscribe to the channel. Because every crime has a final truth.